Hello! Alright, man, so I'm pretty out of the loop on new metal releases, and I've probably heard like 10 new records all year. Not for any philosophical reason, I'm just out of the loop and not really keeping up with new stuff as much. I've actually been spending a lot of time playing the Godfather video game from 2006 for the Xbox 360. I actually find it creatively and artistically a bit more satisfying than some of the stuff that's coming out in the music world right now. Anyway, if you follow the extreme metal world, even if you don't, you might be aware of the whole dissodeath thing. For those who are unaware, dissodeath stands for dissonant death metal. Obviously, a lot of death metal featured dissonant elements before this album, but I always considered Gorguts Obscura to be the beginning of dissodeath as its own little micro genre that eventually became something of a, its own full-fleshed subgenre. And there wasn't much activity in this world going for a while after that record came out, aside from Gorguts and mostly Portal putting out records. And really, once you see the release of Ulcerate's Everything is Fire record in 2009, that's when you kind of started to see the floodgates open up with bands like Mitochondrion flourishing. And every year, man, dissonant death metal just kept snowballing and snowballing. Leading to the past few years, bands like Artificial Brain, Ad Nauseum, others are getting a ton of attention and praise, even from people who normally aren't, into death metal at all, really. This stuff tends to get like a lot of positive remarks for being kind of pensive and reflective sounding. A lot of dissodeath incorporates elements of, bands like Neurosis and stuff like that. It kind of has a perceived experimental aspect to it. Even if, in a lot of cases, there's nothing really experimental or progressive actually there. I could see some of the dorks out there calling it like thinking man's metal or something goofy like that. Basically, man, so Gorguts Obscura, which I do like, by the way, and I own the CD, and I've seen the band and met Luke and all. I've got a fucking Erosion of Sanity shirt. I like Gorguts, but anyway, Obscura was written off as a confusing piece of shit, like a lot of 90s death metal records from back in the day. They were maybe more experimental in nature than most of what was coming out, and it's had kind of like a reappraisal over the years, man, and become influential in its own right, spawning like a ton of imitators. And I mean, on one hand, man, I mean, good for Gorguts, because plenty of other death metal weirdos from back in the day still kind of languish in obscurity, kind of forever cemented into the whole hidden gem status, if you're even that lucky, and Gorguts has managed to basically keep working within the same kind of sonic framework that they laid out on Obscura. In a way, you could kind of say that Gorguts Obscura is like their equivalent to the Steely Dan Asia album, which I'll expand on later. But anyway, man, it's probably no surprise that Gorguts reunited after you started seeing more and more dissodeath records pop up, which also kind of coincided with the rise of the whole OSDM movement in the early 2010s, and with the whole OSDM thing exploding in popularity over the last several years especially, man. You've seen more and more dissodeath releases every year. Particularly, man, a lot of the bands that were called cavernous tend to incorporate more dissodeath elements when they kind of run out of songwriting ideas. And what got me to do this video, man, like I said earlier in the video, man, I haven't been keeping up with new releases as much, so I was curious about what was coming out, man. So I was getting online, and I noticed all the charts on Rate Your Music are kind of dominated by dissodeath now, man. You've seen this happening more and more since like 2019, 2020. I decided to give the new Ulcerate record a chance, and Ulcerate is a band I never really disliked but never loved either. Nothing offensive about them or anything, but they're very much in that kind of Gorguts worship vein of things, but they play up these really slow parts and invest a lot into the overall kind of atmosphere. And the album's called Cutting the Throat of God, which would be a sweet title for like I don't know, Deicide or something. But anyway, the record's an hour long. All dissodeath records have to be an hour long because Obscura is 1 hour long. There are some cool musical moments, man, but the songs all just kind of blend together, man, which I'm aware is like kind of the point, I guess. But still, man, the whole thing kind of sounds like it's building and building in an almost kind of post rock or post metal fashion, but there's never really a payoff, you know. And a lot of people I know who actually know their shit when it comes to death metal, they're praising it to high heaven. And I'll admit it's possible I would have enjoyed it a lot more 10 years ago when this overall sound was a bit more novel to me as like a younger listener. But the record just didn't do much for me, man. And some bands in the dissodeath world, you know, they'll kind of, as opposed to ulcerate, they'll kind of throw in elements of other subgenres like tech death or progressive metal or maybe black metal in an attempt to kind of break up the monotony a little bit. And I mean, you know, in theory, this is much appreciated as a listener, but a lot of bands they just don't really have the songwriting or compositional chops to pull this off without some of these kind of contrasting elements coming off a bit, maybe ham-fisted, shoehorned, on the nose, whatever the right phrase would be, man. So that kind of leads me to like another new release that I noticed was getting a lot of buzz, man, was this album called Perdurance by a band called Convulsing, not to be confused with Convulse from Finland, who did the badass record World Without God. But anyway, man, while I enjoyed elements of this Convulsing record, I just didn't feel like it meshed together very well, man. Oddly enough, my favorite parts of the record were probably those kind of out-of-place, fucking John Petrucci sounding guitar solos that the band throws in when they want to kind of seem progressive, you know? And I was like, damn, that guy's a pretty good guitar player, man. But the thing is, man, I mean, none of it really sounds super fresh, but this album is being praised as this sort of mind-blowing breath of fresh air, as if, like, people are unaware of the past, like, 10 to 15 years of music, you know? And, by the way, man, when I discuss originality, you know, I'm not saying that every album should be a contest to be as avant-garde and as alienating as possible, but, you know, when I'm saying that, like, when an entire subgenre is based around this supposed avant-garde experimental mindset that dissodeath has, sometimes the finished product tends to lack cohesion and the songwriting skill that kind of makes great music stick with us, stick in our head and shit like that, you know. And thing is, man, for my money, you know, which I know is kind of an obvious answer for best dissodeath album, but I don't think any band has pulled this style off better than fucking Gorguts, man, on Obscura when they kind of kickstarted the whole thing. That sort of kind of claustrophobic, unsettling style of riffing, man, it's just never really been matched within this kind of style, you know. I mean, that album's not really one you want to drink beer and bang your head and wear spikes to, but it does, you know, it accomplishes that whole atmospheric experience thing that dissodeath as a subgenre kind of seeks to recreate. And while there aren't really like standout catchy songs or anything, because let's be honest, dissodeath isn't really about the songs anyway, I do think that Obscura is still like an engaging listen, you know. And essentially, man, when you have a record like Gorguts Obscura that's so polarizing and so outside the norm already, I'm kind of starting to think that it's artistically maybe a dead end to try and emulate it, you know? It would kind of be like if someone tried to, like if a bunch of 22-year-old kids got together and tried to rewrite, I'm trying to think, Captain Beefheart, Trout Mask Replica, or fucking, you know, just one of those records, man. I mean, it can only happen once, you know what I mean? And, you know, man, this kind of ties me back to my Steely Dan Asia comparison, man, because, which I mentioned earlier in the video, it's kind of in the same way Gorguts helped invent a style that was retroactively labeled dissodeath. Steely Dan Asia kind of marks the beginning of what would be retroactively called nowadays yacht rock. And, you know, they spawned imitators who try to recreate the production and the style and the overall feel. Sometimes, you know, in Steely Dan's case, even using the same session musicians, man, that were on that record. But no one was ever able to actually nail the songwriting and the overall packaging that made Asia a classic, you know, which I know most of the metalheads watching this video probably think that band sucks. But, you know, my point still stands, you know. And man, when the very beginning of a subgenre accomplishes its highest artistic potential, it can just make a lot of the modern offerings from that same subgenre sound like more of an assembly line. I mean, you've seen this in other subgenres as well, where it'll seem like one or two bands just get ripped off and ripped off and ripped off and My advice to new bands out there, man, if you're I don't know, 20, 22, whatever, and you must start a band that rips off Gorguts, I think you guys should look to the Erosion of Sanity record from '93, man. That's my favorite Gorguts record. It's more technical and weird than Considered Dead, but it's got the songwriting totally down. And to this day, you don't really hear many records at all, if any, really, that kind of have that same sound as Erosion of Sanity. Because honestly, man, I feel like it's probably easier to just like ramp up the dissonance, ramp up the drawn out long sections than it is to actually write a song that's as memorable as Orphans of Sickness, Condemned to Obscurity. I mean, those are tunes, man. Anyway, let me know what you think about all this. I'm kind of just rambling, talking shit, having fun. Let me know if you agree, disagree, whatever. Have a good one, man.